Hello, hello, hello. Good to see you. You get fairy dust, I get fairy dust. Little Amelie gets fairy dust. And it's time for a question for Ask an Advanced Bitch. And that is, what is disenfranchised trauma? So I'm a grief expert and I know about disenfranchised grief. As a grief counselor, some of my clients would be people who their grief was disenfranchised. And what that means is that it's almost like it's not socially acceptable for you to grieve, that the loss that you experience is discounted or minimized or even punished. Um, there are examples like when you have a miscarriage, I think all miscarriages have disenfranchised grief because people, for one, a lot of times it happens in secret. So not everybody gets told about a pregnancy and then it was lost. Um, but also it's like if you lost a child that was 2 years old versus a miscarriage, this person in our culture gets more attention, more care, more support, and this feels invisible. This can feel invisible. I think that's changing. I think that's changing. I think people are getting the support they need, but sometimes when you can't get the support you need, you go see a grief counselor or grief coach. Okay. Another example might be this happened to me, like seeing like a step parent who died, but like the biological children in the family get more attention from the loss of the parent than the stepchild and things like that. Another one is affairs. And so if like you're having an affair and the person that you're having an affair with, they die, like you don't get to go to the funeral, you don't get to da 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 da. And that you can see people's values and judgments and recriminations would be on you. And so you have to suffer in silence and probably feeling shame and confusion, especially if there were plans to be together, that. So those are examples of disenfranchised trauma, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Another like real easy example is how grief with siblings, either adult, like even if it's adults or if it's children, like a death of the sibling, the parents get like, because it's like the worst thing is to, I'm not saying it's not, but I mean, like the culture says, like the worst thing that could possibly happen is to lose a child. And so then you have a child who's lost a sibling. And so what does that mean? And so that can sometimes be disenfranchised. And then like adult siblings that can be disenfranchised. I know I had an uncle died who was closer to me than my dad and he died. And it's like I constantly had to say, and this is how I enfranchised my grief, was like my uncle died, he was like a father to me. Like my uncle died, he walked me down the aisle. So not once but twice. Um so that gives you an example of what disenfranchised grief is. So what is disenfranchised trauma? I think it can be a trauma that you're embarrassed about. I think sometimes medical trauma that has been I mean, the internet has changed a lot and it has enfranchised a lot of trauma, but I think sometimes medical trauma. I think when you have trauma from something that you feel shame about, that gets, our silence, but we're experiencing trauma, so it's actually hard to talk about, because when one of the things that's affected when you are trying to express trauma is um is your voice. And so there's a brain, there's a part of our brain that freezes up, and so if we can't tell people about our trauma, then it gets to disenfranchised. And I just want to be very clear. It's never our fault that our trauma is grief. And sorry, I'm not used to saying trauma, disenfranchised trauma. Um, it's never our fault. It's never our fault. But one thing we can think of is that is our trauma. Am I disenfranchising my trauma? And there's no shame or blame in that. It's just something to be curious about. And then it's like, oh, I need to tell somebody this. And so you can hire somebody or you can tell the safest person so you can be believed and understood. Um, I just read a really good example of a kind of disenfranchised trauma is that back to the sibling thing. If something bad happens to a sibling in the family, maybe some kind of abuse from a parent, and you watch it, like sometimes boys get hit, but the girls might not get hit. And so like the girls will, even though they didn't get quote unquote hit, they have to suffer the trauma of not only not getting hit, they're being traumatized in other ways, but and just the fact that somebody's being hit in the house is trauma. But maybe the guilt of not being hit. And then like the guilt, then that impacts your relationship with your sibling. And so it's just something to think about and something to, that there is no enough with grief. I mean, sorry, there is no enough with trauma. If you felt like, shit has gone down, you just because it's like, and this happens. I've never met a client, and I've said this myself many times. Like what I went through wasn't as bad. That is me disenfranchising my trauma. That is me saying like, and I've noticed like when I would do it as the client in a therapy room, it's like, oh, what I went through is so much less worse than what people are going through and that went through in the past or what they're going through now. And what does that do? It's like, okay, well then I don't have to talk about it. I don't have to, if it's not that bad, if I'm saying it's not that bad, but I have made an appointment and I haven't paid for this appointment. So there's something going on because people who haven't experienced something bad would not make that appointment. But anyway, so it's just something to know. And trauma, we can't treat the trauma. Actually, Van der Kolk just said this. We can't, I was teaching a class. We don't treat the trauma. We treat the impact of the trauma. We can't, if a bad thing happened, if somebody was shot or somebody was in an accident, like no one can fix that because it happened. It's just a fact now. But what we can do is to support and help with every single tool we can possibly imagine the impact that trauma has on you to this day. And we suffer in silence. And these things, the body keeps the score. The body keeps a score. If we're, that title is like, what if we haven't kept the score, the body's going to keep the score. The score is already on the billboard. Like the score has already been posted. The score has happened. Am I willing to look at that score and enfranchise the trauma that I have gone through? And am I willing to look at it and heal it? So maybe you have an example of disenfranchised trauma. I think it's something that we might see. On a related note, it's not, I wouldn't say it's the same thing, and you'll know why in a second, but sometimes when you hear about a trauma, so therapists and, people that work in the ER and people who help people in the, like some of the worst days of their lives, they have what's called secondary trauma or secondary victimization. So if my client's victimized and they're telling me the story, and they get to, because I'm a professional and they're exchanging money for this service. And so part of what I use that money for is to take care of myself because I want to have this job where I am capable of hearing trauma and I just take care of myself um when I need to, but it's a thing. It's a thing. And that's that's one of the things that can cause burnout is when that might be the secondary trauma is too much. But notice there's a word for it. Okay. So that's a way that it's enfranchised. There's another word in my field, in the medical field, called compassion fatigue. And so it is a thing, but you see, when you name it, it becomes less disenfranchised because it's more socially acceptable. And so I do think that we do this to ourselves a lot. So anybody with trauma, one of the symptoms of trauma is minimization. So I guess we could also say one of the symptoms of trauma is disenfranchising self. And so, what are you complaining about? Your life is so great. What are you complaining about? Like you blah blah blah, like you have these privileges, you have these that is just noise that is disenfranchising trauma. And so what we can know is that not on our watch, we refuse to disenfranchise our trauma anymore, and that we refuse to minimize our trauma anymore. And, you know, it's enough. Whatever you've gone through, it's enough. It doesn't matter. There's no points, no winning or losing of shit that has gone down and that our psyche and our sensitive selves have had to endure. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any examples or any other questions about disenfranchised trauma, please let me know. All right. That's it. I'm trying to leave it. All right. Love you. Bye. What a disastrous end. Okay, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm not going to disenfranchise myself. Okay.